Hey yo, I'm back. I was working on a timeline component earlier and I think I figured it out. So I wanted to jump back into it really quick and show you what I figured out. Um, so turns out I was using set state everywhere. The set state, let's see. So one thing to remember about use state, listen up, this is important. One thing to remember is that use state is a replacement setter by default. And I mean, I've been telling myself this since hooks came out. I was like, okay, gotta do that, gotta do that. But so anywhere that you use set state with the use state hook, you are replacing the state. Even if you're using like the functional method or whatever, you are always replacing the state. So it's mandatory. Like if you're decorating the state, like you got to have the old stuff in there. So everywhere that I was using this or set state, man, there were tons of places I was not passing the old in there. So now everywhere you can see it, I'm using set state old and I'm spreading the old state back into it. And honestly, we could make a hook, our own set state hook that does this for us. I just hurried and fixed it because it wasn't a big deal. But like if you look, everywhere in here should have the old state in there. And then the other thing I figured out is it's okay that we were creating the on mouse move and on mouse up and on key down callbacks every single time. That's okay. And yeah, we could get more performant about this by, you know, putting in some parameters that say we should only regenerate these every so often. But right now, I'm actually okay just using an effect that runs on every single render. And all it does is it checks if the mouse is down, and if it is down, then if our state mouse is down, then it adds those event listeners to the last created one. And then it returns a cleanup function to remove those before the next one, before the next render. And what's great is if we're creating these every single time and it's rendering every single time, then with every single drag on this component, yeah, it's removing and adding event listeners between every single one. That might feel heavy, but right now it's not. It actually works just great. So, yeah, I mean, that works. Everything is back to how it was working before. Yeah, and this is a fully hook component. So I just figured we'd kind of go over it again, overview, kind of how things are done. So I'm still using prop types, and I'm using it manually. I'm checking the prop types with the prop types package .check prop types, sending through some of this stuff. And then I destructure, and that's where I do all my defaults. And then I have my global state, which I chose to keep kind of in the same nested format that it was before, just for ease of porting this component over to hooks. I have an element reference. I have a most recent client X ref and a range before drag ref, mostly because I don't want to have to set state to keep track of those things. And it's okay if I just mutate them. Like, they don't need to trigger a new state necessarily. There's a dimensions ref that is being written to whenever the size of the timeline changes. So you can see even as the size of the timeline changes, it's updating the scales, which is pretty neat. So that's what's happening there. Remove event listeners, on mouse up, remove event listeners. You know what? We don't even need that anymore, because when the mouse on mouse up, I'm pretty sure on mouse up should, yeah, it sets our dragging and our mouses down to false. So we don't even need that. Remove event listeners doesn't even need to really be a thing right there, because we're removing them right here. Hey, that's great. Getting rid of some code. We can get rid of that. We have everything in here we just define inline, and people might freak out that, you know, we're making functions and variables every single render. It's not that big of a deal. And, you know, as Ryan Florence has always said, prove to me that it's slow first, and then we'll listen. I'm following that paradigm as well. Like, creating these functions is not a big deal. But hey, we can compute some values and create all of our functions just inline. We could get into some really nifty stuff here and actually memoize some of these values to say, hey, if things never change, like the scale probably doesn't change a whole lot, and the cursor, the tick count and the tick values and stuff, that's not always changing all the time, so we could memoize those. We don't have to, though. You know, that's just a performance thing, and right now it seems to be working great. We're calculating a bunch of things. We have our methods then, so we have the get props that we're sending to the user. We have an on scroll function, on mouse enter, leave, update cursor. Just kind of have all of our functions that we're reusing everywhere. And then, yeah, and then we have this effect, these two effects down here. So this one only runs when the component mounts, and then this runs when it unmounts. And you pass an empty array to do that. And then this use effect is how we're solving the whole document add event listener roundup type thing. We're just running this every single render. If the mouse is down, then we are adding these event listeners. And every single time we are removing the previous event listeners if they existed. So then we're just returning all this data. Dim ref current. I kind of want to dim ref. We could just say dims equals dims ref current. And then anywhere we're using that, we could just say dims. Yeah. So that way we're just returning stuff to our component. Finally, we can get back to our component. So right now, remember, we are proxying this component with this default export of timeline, which allows us to keep using it the way that we were. But if in our app we were ready to actually use this as a hook in our actual application code, then we can get rid of this export default here. Let's just export function use timeline. And then in here, we're going to import use timeline from timeline.js. Let's just call this use timeline, actually. We're going to rename it. Rename use timeline.js. Okay. So use timeline. So now we don't have to do all this render prop crap. And I love that. I hate nesting. You got 1, 2, 3 nesting levels you're just wasting here. So we know we're going to be using our use timeline. All of this stuff is just going to get moved into here. So we can just convert all of this and spread this dot props into there. And then it's going to give us back all of this stuff. Awesome. Then we don't even have to render any of this right here. Boom, boom, boom. Wait, still need that one. Wait. Did we? Const. Oh, I deleted the actual return that I needed. So there we go. Okay, so now let's see. Now I see what's happening here. So now max range. You know what? Let's just take, just so we're not conflicting on variables here, we're going to just pass in all this state. We don't need that anymore. Then we don't have conflicting properties there. And hooks can only be called inside of the body of a function component. Yes. So now we can refactor this. So export default function, my timeline. Oh, this is my favorite part. State. So now we can just say const state set state equals use state. These just become callbacks as functions. No more render. We get to unnest that. On view range change, so none, this doesn't need to be there, and those are called the same thing. Let's see, use state now. What are we getting now? Oh, yeah. Use state. Let's bring that in. Okay, so now is assigned a value but never used. Well, that's not true. I'm using it right here. We'll call this default now. State, well, there is no more this dot, so we can just do that. And props are coming in right here. And set state is doing this. And let's make sure we use the old state this time. Okay, everything just got much flatter. This is great. Still works the same. This is how hooks should feel. Love it. So, yeah, we just refactored that out. We're not using add hours. Are we using sub hours? Oh, guess we're not using other than date functions anymore. Okay, and then we'll go to our index, and this can actually just become function app. That returns. Okay, we just got rid of all the classes in this example. We're using hooks everywhere. It's great. So yeah, told you we could figure it out. Let's see. You know, it's kind of funny. We actually ended up with more lines in this component this time around. We started with 567 lines, and we ended up with 590. But I actually think that's mostly to do with everything becoming a lot flatter. My bet is that there's way less code in here. The things are easier to understand, and everything just got flattened out a little more. That's something to remember when you're refactoring the hooks. Just because just because you're not deleting lines of code does not mean that your code is getting simpler and easier to understand. Everything's a lot flatter now. We're using consts everywhere. We get to define our state and our props one time. And it's just a function. It's beautiful. So thanks for coming back, checking out how we actually figured out how to do this. Maybe I can stitch these two videos together later on, but for now, yeah, that's it. Thanks for hanging out. See ya.